Hey guys, so we're going to do a little bit of factoring review. So, the first thing that you look for whenever you're factoring is how many terms that you have. So, or I'm sorry, look for a greatest common factor first. So, look for a greatest common factor before you get started with factoring. And then you're going to look for how many terms you have. Okay, so how many terms are there? So if there are two terms, we have some rules for two terms. So two terms come from binomials multiplied together, or a binomial times a trinomial multiplied together is how you create those two-term polynomials. So the first one is going to be the difference of squares. So what that means is that the first term is a perfect square and the second term is a perfect squared, and what's in between there is a minus sign, difference sign. So this one's going to factor to two binomials. One is going to have a minus sign and one is going to have a plus sign. So they're conjugates of each other. So this will be x minus y times x plus a y. Let's say the sum of two, can't have sum of two squares, that will not factor. So sum of two squares will not factor. So sum of two cubes is the only time that you can have a sum. So when it's a sum of two cubes, you're going to have a binomial times a trinomial. Inside this binomial is going to be the plus sign, so it's going to be the same exact thing, but just one. So the term, whatever the term is here, cubed, whatever this term is cubed, you're going to have one of those right there. And then you're going to have inside of here SOPs. Okay, and so what that means is that you're going to square this term. It's going to be the opposite sign. It's going to be the product of the two. It's going to always be a plus sign no matter what. And then it's going to be the square of that last term. So it's square, opposite, product, plus always, and a square. You can also have a difference of two cubes. So you can have x cubed minus a y cubed. So it's the same thing. It's a binomial times a trinomial. So just remember your SOPs. Okay, so it's 1 squared, opposite, so it's going to be a plus sign there. The product of the two, so it'll be x times y. Always a plus sign, and then the last term squared. Okay. Alright, so let's take a second and let's do some questions here. So let's factor 24x to the fourth minus 54 x cubed. Okay, so what do I look for first? So I've got a 24x to the fourth minus a 54x to the third. So what is the greatest common factor? What do I have in common here? Okay, I have a number. I have 24 and I've got a 54. So 24 is what? 6 times 4. 54 is 6 times 9, right? So I have a greatest common factor of a 6. So I can factor a 6 out, and then I've got x to the fourth and I've got x cubed. So I can factor out an x cubed there. So if I factor out an x cubed, I will be left with 4x minus a 9. And that's it. All right, what about this one? X cubed plus a 125. So x cubed plus a 125. So I've got a plus sign. This is a perfect cubed, 125. Is that a perfect cubed? 5 times 5 times 5, so that is a 5 cubed. So I've got the sum of two cubes, so I'm going to have a binomial times a trinomial. So it's going to be x plus a 5 times x squared. So one of those, the opposite sign, the product of the two, always a plus sign, and then this 5 squared, which gives you 25. And you can always check your factoring by doing what? Multiplying everything back. Okay, so what about this one? So 16 is a perfect square, and x to the 4th is a perfect square. 1 is a perfect square, and I've got a minus sign in between there, so this is going to be the difference of two squares. Okay, so if it's the difference of two squares, 16 is a 4 squared, and x squared is squared, gives you an x to the 4th. So this is going to be binomial with one that's got a minus sign and one that's got a plus sign. So this is going to be a 4x squared minus 1 and a 4x squared plus a 1. Can this one keep going? This one can keep going here. So this one, this minus 1 here is the difference of two squares. So we'll have a 2x minus a 1 times a 2x plus a 1. And then we'll have a 4x squared plus a 1, and we'll just bring that one down. So about this one, x squared plus a 9, it's the sum of two squares, but that is brown. All right, what about this one? This one's x cubed minus 343. So x cubed minus a 343. 343 is a perfect cube. It's a 7 cubed. So this one's going to be a binomial times a trinomial. So it'll be x minus 7, x squared, opposite sign, product, plus, and then this last term squared. Check it by multiplying it out. Okay? Alright, so that's your two terms and your greatest common factor in your two terms. So if you have four terms, then you are going to factor by grouping. And this is going to help you when you factor trinomials that have a number in front of the x squared term, is the grouping. I know you probably learned it a few different ways, but grouping is the best way to factor any type of trinomial that you need to. So four terms factor by grouping here. So let's do an example for that one. I guess we'll just say call it 6 there. So, factor by grouping. So what that means is that you will factor the first two terms. So you'll group the first two terms together, and you'll factor out a greatest common factor in the first set. And then you will group the last two terms, and you will factor out a greatest common factor in the last two. So we're going to group the first two, and we'll group the second two, and that minus sign right there is going to change when you factor something out right there. It's going to change the sign. So I can factor out an x squared, and I'll have an x plus a 7 here. I can factor out a minus 5, so I'll have x. This will change to a plus a 7. So I can factor now, my greatest common factor is an x plus a 7, right? And I'll have x squared minus a 5 left. So if you're looking, this is a term because that's multiplication right there. This is one term and this is two terms. So you can factor out an x plus a 7, factor out this x plus a 7, and that's where this x plus a 7 comes from. Okay? Alright, let's do one more. Factoring by grouping. So we're going to factor the first two, factor the second two. Out of the first grouping, we can factor out an x squared, and we'll have an x minus a 3 left. Out of the second grouping, we will factor out a 4, and we'll have x minus a 3 left. Your x minus the 3's are the same, so you can factor those out. Those are your GCF. So you'll factor an x minus 3 out, and what you'll have in the second binomial is this x squared plus a 4. Okay. All right. So then you've got three terms. So three terms, you've got two ways to do three terms. When there is nothing in front of the x squared. So three terms is just a trinomial. So x squared plus bx plus c. So you have that one. And then you have it where there is a number in front of your x squared. So remember, when you're multiplying your binomials together, that a comes from what's in front. So like if I have 2x plus 1 times 3x minus 5, and I were to multiply that out, your a comes from multiplying 2x times 3x together. So that's what you've got to figure out, what those two values are. So what we like to do is group. It just makes a lot more sense. So what we're going to do is try to figure out what multiplies together to give you C, or what multiplies together to give you A times C. And then you're going to replace that B term by those two values. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do one. And I think I'm on 8 here, and I'm going to do this one. This one is simple, but I'm going to do it the long way by grouping, just so that you can get kind of accustomed to the grouping method. You do not have to group this one because there is nothing in front of the x squared here, right? So I've got x squared minus 13x minus 30. So I've got to figure out what multiplies together to give me a negative 30 and adds together to give me a negative 13. So what multiplies together to give me a negative 30 and adds together to give me a negative 13? So that's going to be what? Negative 10. Oh, no, that's not right. Yep, negative 10 times 3 gives you a negative 30, but does negative 10 plus a 3 add together to give me a negative 13? Nope. What about negative 15 times 2? Negative 15 times 2 multiplies together to give you a negative 30, and negative 15 plus a 2 adds together to give you a 13. So this is what I mean now to replace. So I'm going to say x squared minus a 15x plus a 2x minus a 30. So I'm going to replace the middle term with those two. So you're going to group, Out of this first grouping, you're going to factor out an x, and you'll have an x minus a 15. Out of the second grouping, you're going to factor out a 2, and you'll have an x minus a 15. Your x minus a 15s are the same. There you go. That one, the factors are always going to be the same, okay? But when there's a number in front of the x squared, they're not always going to be the same. So let's do one like that. Is there a greatest common factor? No. So we're going to say 2 times negative 7. So what multiplies together to give me a negative 14? And at the same time adds together to give me a negative 13. So what is that? Negative 14 times 1 and negative 14 plus a 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace that negative 13x with negative 14x plus 1x minus a 7. So basically you're expanding the FOIL. Okay, so remember, when you multiply binomials together, you end up with 4 terms. Okay, so when you end up with those 4 terms, then you can always combine the middle two. So what you're doing is expanding it back to 4 terms. So basically, grouping is the best way to do it, just because you're always going to get it right, because you are expanding that FOIL. There are multiple ways to factor trinomials that have numbers in front, but this is the best way. Then you will factor by grouping here. So factor out a 2 and an x, and then you'll have an x minus 7. And out of the second grouping, you can factor out a 1. You'll have an x minus a 7. Your x minus a 7s are the same, and then you'll bring your 2x plus a 1 in the second binomial. All right, what about this one? Okay, so trinomial, this follows the trinomial term. So this first term is a squared, and then this one is just a single term, right? So basically your trinomial, it has to be the middle term squared is what this exponent is going to be. So is your x squared term squared here? And it is. If this was an x to the third, you couldn't factor this one. This one would not factor. Okay, so what multiplies together to give you a negative 20 and adds together to give you a negative 1? So what's that going to be? Negative 5 times 4, negative 5 plus 4. So this will be x squared minus a 5, right? And x squared plus a 4, because there's no number on the front. Okay, but let's factor it by grouping, just so that we can check ourselves and make sure. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say x to the 4th minus 5x squared plus a 4x squared minus a 20. And then we got 4 terms, so we're going to group. Out of the first grouping, I can factor out an x squared, and I'll have an x squared minus a 5. Out of the second grouping, I'll factor out a 4, and I will have an x squared minus a 5. These are the same, so you'll factor out that x squared minus a 5, and you'll have left that x squared plus a 4. So there you go. That's how you do it by grouping. All right, let's look at number 11. Number 11, you've got to do it by grouping, unless you do trial and error, which you can just think about some binomials that multiply together to give you this, which is fine too. So what multiplies together to give you a negative 6 and adds together to give you a negative 1? So that'll be what? Negative 3 times a 2 and negative 3 plus a 2. So we're going to have a 3x squared minus 3x plus a 2x minus a 2. Group and group. Out of the first grouping, you'll factor out a 3x, and you'll have an x minus a 1. Now the second grouping, you'll factor out a 2, and you'll have an x minus a 1. So you'll have an x minus a 1 times 3x plus a 2. There you go. So there are your groupings. Alright, so get some more practice in, and if you have any questions, let me know.